I think the Queen's duty and her service, her tolerance, her commitment to others, I think that's all been incredibly important to me, and it's been a real sort of guiding example.
Prince William couldn't hold back tears. What Princess Charlotte did at Diana's 65th birthday shocked UK. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the scene that unfolded around Princess Diana's 65th birthday was not supposed to become a story about Prince William's tears. July 1st, 2026, was meant to pass quietly, with Diana remembered privately and the royal household keeping the day away from spectacle. Then Princess Charlotte stepped forward, placed a handwritten letter beside Diana's photograph, and changed the mood in the room within seconds. The account surrounding that private tribute describes Charlotte as an 11-year-old girl standing in front of a grandmother she never had the chance to meet. She did not make a grand speech. She did not need cameras. She simply left a message promising to carry forward the compassion Diana showed toward vulnerable children. And when William saw what she had written, his reaction became impossible to hide. Now, watch this carefully, because this is where the story stops being a simple family tribute.
Of just what sort of a good monarch can be. And it's been incredibly insightful for me growing up, watching her leadership in that role.
The emotional moment was not only about Charlotte remembering Diana, it was about a son seeing his mother's legacy reflected in his own daughter. For William, Diana is not merely the woman the world remembers through photographs and documentaries. She is the mother whose absence has followed him for nearly 3 decades. Charlotte's gesture reportedly touched that private wound in a way no official ceremony could. Hi viewers, if a child in your family did something this meaningful to honor someone you had lost, would you want everyone to know about it, or would you keep that moment private? Put your answer in the comments, because this is exactly where the story becomes personal. And if you believe moments like this deserve to be heard, instead of buried beneath palace headlines, subscribe, like this video, and share it. Doing nothing means letting the most human part of the story disappear, while everyone argues about the royal institution around it. The room, according to the account, was already carrying the strange silence that comes with an anniversary of loss. Then Charlotte approached Diana's photograph. Her movement was small. That was precisely why it mattered. She placed the handwritten note beside the tribute and stepped back. The words were simple, centered on love, memory, and a promise to care about children who needed help. There was no attempt to sound like a future queen. There was no polished royal language. It looked like a granddaughter trying to speak to a woman she had only known through stories. William saw it, and for a moment, the future king was not the man the cameras usually see, standing beside Catherine at a public engagement. He was a son, watching his 11-year-old daughter reach toward a mother who had been gone since 1997. The account describes William becoming visibly emotional, struggling to contain the tears before turning away. That reaction is the detail that gives the entire scene its weight, because Charlotte could not possibly understand every layer of what Diana meant to him. She could understand love. She could understand a grandmother whose photograph had always been part of her family. She could understand that there were children in the world who needed someone to care about them. But William understood everything else. He understood the memories behind the photograph. He understood the years before Charlotte was born. He understood what it meant to watch the public turn a mother into a symbol while a family was left with the private reality of losing her. And suddenly, standing there, he was watching that legacy move into another generation. That is why the handwritten letter matters. It was not simply a birthday note. It was a statement about inheritance. Not inheritance in the sense of crowns, estates, titles, or jewels. Something far more difficult to pass down. A way of seeing people. A willingness to stop and look at suffering that powerful institutions might prefer to keep at a comfortable distance.
it was an idea, but actually it was actually going back right to the beginning when we were looking at the different ways in which we can work with the foundation. And I suppose I'd learned through meeting some of my patronagers that there were some of these underlying causes across so many different sectors.
And Charlotte's choice reportedly caught the adults around her off guard, because it appeared to come from her own growing understanding of Diana. That detail is important. The story is not built around a formal palace plan. It is built around a child making a personal decision on a day that belonged to someone she had never met. Then came the question that changed the atmosphere again. How did Charlotte know Diana's words? According to the account, palace aides and family members began wondering how an 11-year-old could have expressed ideas so closely connected to Diana's own language and causes. That question opened a much deeper mystery, because Charlotte had never sat across from Diana. She had never heard her grandmother speak. She had never watched her walk through a hospital ward, visit children, or speak directly to people who were suffering. Everything Charlotte knew had been passed to her, through photographs, through family stories, through objects, through conversations with Catherine and William, and possibly through something far more personal, something that had been kept away from the public. The first clue had actually appeared weeks earlier, almost unnoticed beneath the noise of royal appearances. At Trooping the Colour on June 13th, Charlotte was seen wearing a 3-strand pearl bracelet that closely echoed one associated with Diana. Catherine wore the original piece, while Charlotte appeared beside her with a matching version. To casual viewers, it could have looked like another carefully coordinated royal family detail. But within the story, it becomes something else. A quiet signal, a daughter standing beside her mother while both carried an echo of Diana. Then, on July 1st, the bracelet was no longer the main clue. Charlotte's letter was. And the letter raised a question that could not be brushed aside with a photograph or a fashion explanation. Who had helped Charlotte understand Diana deeply enough to write it? The answer, according to the account, leads directly to Catherine. Catherine had reportedly spent years making sure Diana remained more than a name inside the family, not a tragic figure locked behind old photographs, not a royal icon whose story could only be discussed in public. A person, a mother, a grandmother Charlotte never met, but could still learn to know. That distinction matters because children eventually stop accepting family stories at face value. They start asking questions. Why did she die? What was she like at home? What did she care about? What made her happy? What made her afraid? And eventually, the hardest question of all, what did she want her children to remember? Charlotte had reached that stage. And according to the account, Catherine did not answer with another biography. She gave her something personal. That is where the birthday story begins to change. Because once Charlotte started asking what Diana had actually been like, the past stopped looking like history. It started looking like family. And William was about to discover that Catherine had been holding on to something that could make that distance disappear altogether. Something connected to Diana herself. Something preserved quietly. Something William apparently had not been prepared to confront until Charlotte opened that door. And that was where everything changed completely. If you want to know why William's tears were only the beginning, stay with this story, because the next revelation turns Charlotte's innocent tribute into something far more personal. And if this moment means anything to you, do not scroll away and leave it buried. The detail that changed how Charlotte understood Diana was not a photograph, a jewel, or a royal story. It was a question about people nobody in the palace could protect with protocol. Charlotte wanted to understand why Diana had spent so much of her public life walking toward people others avoided. That question matters because Diana's legacy was never built only around glamour. The clothes, the cameras, and the royal headlines became the easiest parts of her story to remember. The harder part was what she chose to do when attention could have been used for something more comfortable.
How are we going to build something that's going to provide almost a vehicle to allow us to impact in charitable areas? Because it was quite difficult at the time. Harry and I used to go to a lot of engagements and see these incredible charities doing really great work.
Diana repeatedly put herself in places where suffering could not be hidden behind ceremony. She visited hospitals. She met people living with HIV and AIDS when fear and misinformation still surrounded the illness. She supported causes involving children, homelessness, and people affected by conflict. Her public image changed because she did not always stand at a safe distance from the people she wanted the world to notice. For Charlotte, those decisions belonged to another generation. She did not experience the criticism that followed Diana. She did not witness the arguments over her public role. She did not see the photographers surrounding her. She inherited the consequence without living through the controversy. That difference matters. Charlotte can look at Diana without carrying the same memories William carries. She can ask what Diana did without first remembering what Diana's death took away. She can study the woman before she fully understands the tragedy. That may explain why her questions reportedly became more direct. She was not asking for the version of Diana prepared for documentaries. She wanted the version that existed inside the family. What did Diana laugh about? What did she notice? What did she do when nobody was watching? What did she say about children? Those questions created an uncomfortable problem for anyone trying to preserve a clean royal narrative. The public knows Diana through thousands of images and countless accounts, but a family remembers someone through tiny details that never become headlines. A favorite habit, a familiar expression, a story repeated at the dinner table. A memory that sounds insignificant until the person who owned it is gone. Catherine understood that difference. The role she reportedly took inside the family was not to turn Diana into a permanent monument. It was to allow her children to know that the woman behind the photographs had ordinary moments too. That matters for Charlotte, because children do not build emotional connections through official statements. They build them through repetition. A name becomes familiar. A photograph becomes recognizable. A story becomes part of family language. Eventually, the person in the photograph begins to feel less distant. That process was already happening inside the household, but the 65th birthday pushed it into a new stage. Charlotte was old enough to move beyond simple curiosity. She could begin deciding which parts of Diana's legacy mattered to her. And one part stood out: children. Diana's work with vulnerable people was not simply a collection of royal appearances. It reflected a belief that public attention could be used to make ignored people visible. That idea is especially significant for Charlotte because she is growing up inside an institution built around visibility. Every appearance can become a photograph. Every gesture can be analyzed. Every word can become a headline. Diana showed a different possibility. Attention could be redirected. A famous person could make someone else the focus. A royal could enter a difficult environment and force millions of people to look at what they might otherwise avoid. That is the part of Diana's legacy Charlotte could inherit without inheriting Diana's life. And that distinction becomes important when considering the letter. The wording reportedly centered on continuing Diana's concern for vulnerable children. Whether every detail of the account can be independently confirmed is another matter, but the idea fits the larger pattern surrounding Charlotte's growing interest in her grandmother. The letter was not presented as a declaration about the monarchy. It was about responsibility. That makes the gesture more significant than a birthday tribute. Charlotte was not claiming Diana's position. She was identifying with Diana's purpose. For William, that distinction carried enormous emotional weight. His mother had spent years being reduced to competing versions of herself. To some, she was the rebellious princess. To others, the humanitarian. To others, the global celebrity whose private life became public property. Inside her family, she was something simpler. She was Mum. Charlotte could never recover the relationship William lost, but she could learn about the person behind the public image. That is where the emotional tension deepened, because William has spent much of his adult life balancing two versions of Diana. There is the mother he remembers, and the public figure everyone else claims to remember. Those versions overlap, but they are not identical. Charlotte entered that divide without knowing how complicated it was. Her questions were innocent. The answers were not. Every answer about Diana carried another memory for William. Every new detail Charlotte discovered could bring the past closer. That creates a very different kind of pressure inside a family. Protecting a child from painful history eventually has to give way to trusting that child with enough truth to understand it. Catherine reportedly chose that moment carefully. She did not need to overwhelm Charlotte with every difficult detail. She could start with the human ones. That approach explains why the story did not begin with a grand royal announcement. It developed through ordinary family conversation. And ordinary conversation can be more powerful than ceremony. A palace statement can tell millions of people what an anniversary means. A mother answering her daughter's question can change what one child believes about her grandmother. That private education explains why the birthday gesture carried such force. Charlotte was not simply repeating something adults had instructed her to say. She had been learning. She had been asking. She had been forming her own picture of Diana. Then she reached the point every child eventually reaches when a family story stops being enough. She wanted something real, not another photograph, not another public memory, not another explanation of why the world loved Diana. She wanted a detail that belonged to Diana herself. That request placed Catherine in a difficult position, because there were memories that could be shared casually, and there were others that could reopen wounds. There was also the question of William. What should a child be told about a grandmother whose death still carries emotional weight for her father? What happens when the child asking for family history is also the daughter of the person most affected by that history? Catherine had to navigate both. The answer, according to the account, was to give Charlotte enough truth to make Diana feel human without turning her into a subject of mourning. That decision appears to have worked. Charlotte began seeing Diana not as a distant princess, but as someone whose choices could influence her. And that is the point where the story takes its next turn, because Charlotte's curiosity did not stop with learning about Diana. She wanted to do something herself, something small, something private, something that would make the connection hers. That decision would eventually expose the most unexpected part of the story, because the information Charlotte had absorbed about Diana did not come only from stories told around the family. There was another layer, and once that layer came into view, William's emotional reaction on July 1st became easier to understand. If this story matters, do not let the noise around the royal family drown out the child at its center. Stay with it, share it, and subscribe now, because what Charlotte discovered next would take this birthday far beyond a family remembrance. The next decision Charlotte made was almost impossible to notice. There was no announcement. No palace photographer was positioned to capture it. No aide stepped forward to explain what she was doing. Charlotte simply wanted to take the memory she had been given and turn it into something she could keep. According to the account, that began with flowers. The detail sounds ordinary, but within this story, it became the bridge between an 11-year-old girl and a grandmother she had never met. Charlotte had learned about Diana's habit of pressing flowers between the pages of books, and instead of treating the detail as another family anecdote, she reportedly wanted to try it herself. That choice mattered because it showed how Charlotte was processing everything she had been told. She was not collecting facts. She was creating a connection. A child cannot recover a lost relationship through photographs. She cannot hear a grandmother's voice or remember a conversation that never happened.
to grow into a particular role with the right characteristics and the right qualities. And I think she's exemplified that.
What she can do is take something associated with that person and make it part of her own world. So the flowers became important, not because they were valuable, not because they belonged to the crown, because they were ordinary. That was exactly the kind of detail that could make Diana feel real. The account describes Charlotte spending time with flowers from the garden and wanting to preserve them. The adults around her reportedly understood the significance before she fully could. To them, the act carried the weight of a family memory. To Charlotte, it was simply something Diana had once done, and therefore something worth trying. That difference gave the moment its emotional force. The adults knew what had been lost. Charlotte was discovering what had been inherited. Catherine's role became especially important here. She was not simply answering questions. She was deciding which memories could safely be passed from one generation to another. That is a delicate position when the person being remembered is Diana. Almost every detail about Diana has a public history attached to it. A dress can become an exhibition. A photograph can become a headline. A speech can be analyzed decades later. Even a piece of jewelry can suddenly become a symbol. But a pressed flower is different. It belongs to nobody but the person who chooses to keep it. That may be why the detail reportedly affected the adults in the room so strongly. Charlotte was taking something private and making it hers. Then she began writing. The handwritten letter was not described as a formal royal document. It was personal. Its importance came from the fact that Charlotte was trying to express what Diana meant to her, even though their relationship existed entirely through stories and memory. The central promise was simple: to care about vulnerable children and continue something meaningful from Diana's example. That is where the birthday changed direction. Until then, the day could still be understood as a family remembering a famous woman. Charlotte's actions changed that. She was no longer only receiving Diana's story, she was responding to it. That distinction is crucial. A legacy becomes powerful when the next generation chooses what to carry. Charlotte could have inherited the image of Diana as a fashion icon. She could have inherited the photographs, the jewelry, and the fascination surrounding her name. Instead, the gesture placed attention on the people Diana had tried to help. For William, that would have been impossible to separate from his own memories. He knew the difference between Diana as the world saw her and Diana as his mother. Charlotte was beginning to learn that difference too. But there was still a problem. Some of the language in Charlotte's message reportedly sounded remarkably close to ideas associated with Diana herself. That raised the question that would not go away. Where had Charlotte heard those words? The obvious answer would have been Catherine. She had been helping the children understand Diana, but the account suggested something more complicated. Catherine had preserved a private message connected to Diana. That revelation changed the meaning of the birthday entirely. If the message existed, then Charlotte's knowledge was not based only on public material. Somewhere inside the family was a piece of Diana's personal history that had remained outside the public record. And that meant William might not have known everything Catherine had preserved. This is where the story needs careful distinction. The existence and contents of such a private message are part of the reported account surrounding this story, not something that can be treated as independently established fact. But as a narrative development, it explains why the question surrounding Charlotte's words became so difficult to ignore. Catherine was suddenly connected to the mystery, not as someone creating drama, as someone protecting a memory. The timing also mattered. Charlotte had reached an age where she could understand more than a child's simplified version of Diana. She could begin to recognize that her grandmother had been admired, criticized, hurt, and loved, sometimes all at once. That meant the family could no longer keep Diana entirely inside the safe boundaries of childhood stories. The questions had become more serious, and serious questions require serious answers. Catherine reportedly understood that. She could have dismissed Charlotte's curiosity. She could have redirected the conversation towards something easier. Instead, the story suggests she allowed Charlotte to see another side of Diana, a woman who cared deeply, a woman who made mistakes, a woman who was sometimes overwhelmed, a woman who still tried to reach people who needed to be seen. That fuller picture was important because it prevented Charlotte from inheriting a myth instead of a person. Then came the part that affected William most. Charlotte's letter was placed beside Diana's photograph. William saw the words. He saw his daughter's handwriting, and behind those words, he could hear the values he associated with his mother. The scene reportedly became quiet. No one needed to explain why. William had spent years hearing people discuss Diana's legacy. Now his daughter was standing in front of him and claiming a small part of it for herself. That was different. It was intimate, it was unavoidable, and it opened a question William could not answer simply by looking at a photograph. What would Diana have thought of Charlotte? That question reaches beyond royal history. It reaches into the private imagination of a son who lost his mother before he could watch her become a grandmother. William knows what Diana was like as a mother because he lived it. Charlotte can only imagine what she might have been like as a grandmother. For one brief moment, those two versions met. The daughter, who never knew Diana, stood beside the son who did. And Catherine was the person standing between them, carrying memories from one generation into the next. But there was still something Catherine had not given William. Something she had preserved, something sealed. And the more Charlotte learned, the harder it became to keep that private piece of Diana's story separate from the birthday that had already reopened so many emotions. The question was no longer whether Charlotte had connected with Diana. She clearly had. The question was whether William was finally ready to discover what had been kept from him. And that distinction mattered. A public tribute could be photographed, discussed, and eventually forgotten. A private message was different. It belonged to the family. It carried the possibility of a truth that had never been shaped for cameras, headlines, or royal statements. That was why Catherine's decision carried consequences far beyond Charlotte's birthday. That is where the story was about to become far more personal, because the next step would take the family from Charlotte's handwritten promise to the sealed message Catherine had been protecting. The envelope had no royal crest on it, no public seal, no reason for anyone outside the family to know it existed. Yet according to the accounts surrounding this story, that private envelope was the object that changed everything. Catherine had reportedly kept the sealed message because she understood something William had spent years learning the hard way. A memory can be preserved without being ready to be opened. Some words become heavier with time. Some memories need distance before they can be faced without destroying the person carrying them. That is why the timing mattered. William had spent almost 3 decades living with Diana's absence. He had grown from a grieving teenager into a husband, father, senior royal, and future king. The world had watched every stage, but public growth does not erase private grief. A person can learn how to function around a loss without ever becoming comfortable with it. Catherine knew that distinction. According to the reported account, she did not regard the sealed message as something that should automatically be handed to William simply because it concerned his mother. She believed there had to be a moment when he could receive it as William, not as Prince of Wales, not as a public figure, and not as the son of Diana whom millions of people still claimed to know. That difference is crucial. The world has always wanted something from William whenever Diana's name appears. A reaction, a memory, a photograph, a statement, a glimpse of grief. But William's relationship with his mother does not belong to the public. Catherine could understand that. The decision to preserve the message therefore becomes the emotional center of the story. It suggests that something connected to Diana had been protected from the machinery surrounding the royal family. No cameras, no official anniversary statement, no carefully prepared wording for reporters, just a sealed message. And then Charlotte's letter changed the timing. Her decision to honor Diana through the welfare of vulnerable children created a connection between past and present that was impossible to manufacture. She was not asking William to remember his mother. She was showing him that his mother's values had reached his own child. That could explain why his reaction was so strong. William had spent years protecting Diana's memory from becoming nothing more than a public spectacle. Yet here was Charlotte, doing something completely different. She was making the memory personal without knowing how painful it could be. The reported account suggests that Catherine saw the moment as a possible turning point. Not because Charlotte had forced anything, because Charlotte had created the kind of moment Catherine had been waiting for. A moment when William might be able to hear Diana's words without hearing only the tragedy surrounding them. That is an important distinction. For years, Diana's death has been the shadow attached to almost every conversation about her. Her life is often discussed through the final chapter: the crash, the investigation, the funeral, the mourning crowds, the photographs of William and Harry walking behind her coffin. But a message from Diana could reverse that order. It could put her voice before her death, her identity before the mythology. That possibility would make the envelope more than a family keepsake. It would become a direct line between mother and son. But there was another complication. William had never been the only person affected by Diana's legacy. His children were growing up inside it. George, Charlotte, and Louis would eventually have to understand why their grandmother remains such a powerful figure decades after her death. Charlotte had reached that stage earlier than expected. She was asking questions. She was making connections. And now she had written a promise of her own. That meant Catherine faced a choice: keep the private message sealed and preserve the boundary around William's grief, or allow the family to acknowledge that the next generation was already reaching toward Diana. The story suggests she chose the second path carefully. Not publicly, not through a statement, through the family. That is why the sealed message carries so much tension. Its power does not come from some spectacular secret revealed to the world. Its power comes from the possibility that Diana left words capable of reaching William in a way public memories never could. And this is where the story becomes more complicated than the headline. The headline asks why William cried. The deeper question asks what his daughter accidentally unlocked. Because Charlotte did not simply remind William that Diana was his mother. She reminded him that Diana was becoming part of his children's identity. That changes grief. A memory that once belonged to the past suddenly becomes something the future wants to inherit. William could remember Diana as a young mother. Charlotte could imagine her as an older grandmother. Those two images could never meet in reality. But inside the family, they could meet through stories. The sealed message represented the most intimate version of that connection. According to the account, Catherine believed William was finally ready to hear it. It suggests there had been a reason for waiting. Perhaps William needed time to build his own family first. Perhaps watching Charlotte grow gave him a different understanding of what Diana might have been like with grandchildren. Perhaps the distance of nearly 30 years had changed the way he could approach memories that once felt unbearable. Those possibilities cannot be treated as established facts. They belong to the interpretation surrounding the reported story. But emotionally, the logic is clear. A man who lost his mother as a teenager is not the same person after becoming a father himself. William now knows what it means to watch a child grow. He knows the small habits parents remember, the questions children ask, the expressions that suddenly resemble another family member. He knows how quickly childhood disappears. That could make Diana's absence feel different. When William was young, Diana was his mother. When William became a father, he could begin imagining the grandmother she never became. And Charlotte's presence would make that absence impossible to ignore. That is why her letter carried such force. It did not merely look backward, it looked forward. It suggested that Diana's influence could continue without turning Charlotte into a replacement for her grandmother. Charlotte could become herself while still carrying something from Diana. That is the healthiest form of legacy. Not imitation, continuation. The sealed message now sat at the center of that emotional shift. Catherine had protected it. Charlotte had unknowingly created the moment. William was the person who had to decide whether he could finally open the door. And there was one more question. If Diana's message was personal enough to be kept sealed, why had it remained private for so long? That question could not be answered by a photograph or a palace statement. It required William to confront the words himself. The room had already changed because of Charlotte. The birthday had already become more than an anniversary. But the deepest part of the story had not yet happened, because once the envelope was finally brought into the conversation, the focus shifted away from Charlotte's tribute and toward the one person whose voice had been missing from the room for nearly 30 years. Diana. Her photograph was there. Her legacy was there. Her granddaughter was there. Her son was there. And now, according to the reported account, something bearing Diana's private words was there too. That was the moment when William could no longer remain only an observer of his mother's memory. He had to face it. And if the reported account is accurate, what happened next was not the kind of royal moment that could be managed by aides, rehearsed by advisors, or softened by an official statement. It was simply a son confronting the possibility that his mother had left him something he had never heard. That is why the next revelation matters more than the envelope itself. The question was never simply what Diana wrote. The real question was why Catherine believed William needed to hear it now. If you have stayed this long, do not let the story stop here. Share it and subscribe, because the next part reaches the one moment the entire story has been building toward. And this time, William could not hide what Diana's words did to him. The moment William finally faced the message, the story stopped being about a birthday. It became about what happens when a child unknowingly opens a door that an entire family has spent years learning how to approach. Charlotte had already made her choice. She had written her promise, connected herself to Diana's concern for vulnerable children, and placed those words beside the woman she knew only through family memory. Now the attention turned to William. According to the reported account, Catherine believed the timing was finally right. The decision was not presented as a public royal announcement. It was a private family matter, surrounded by the kind of silence that exists when nobody wants a deeply personal memory turned into a spectacle. That distinction matters because William has spent his adult life being asked to explain Diana while rarely being allowed to simply remember her. The world has had decades to form opinions about Diana. William had decades to live with the consequences of losing her. Those are not the same thing. A public anniversary can create headlines for a day. A private message can reopen a relationship that never had the chance to continue. The reported account does not establish every detail of what the message contained, and its precise wording should not be treated as confirmed. What matters within the story is the significance attached to it. Diana had supposedly left words that were personal enough to remain protected, and Catherine believed William had reached a point where he could finally receive them. That possibility changes the meaning of the entire birthday. Charlotte was not the ending. She was the trigger. Her letter did something no official tribute could do. It placed Diana inside the future rather than leaving her trapped inside the past. William could look at his daughter and see someone who never knew Diana, yet somehow understood the part of Diana that mattered most to her. That is a difficult realization for any parent. It forces the question of what survives after a person is gone. But values survive only when another person chooses to live by them. That is what made Charlotte's promise important. She was not claiming to become Diana. She was not repeating a royal duty written for her by advisors. She was responding to a story she had been given and deciding that one part of it mattered enough to carry forward. He had known Diana as a mother. Charlotte was discovering Diana as a grandmother. Neither experience could replace the other. But together, they created something Diana herself never had the opportunity to witness. That is the deeper reason the tears matter. They are evidence of what the moment represented. William was watching his daughter build a relationship with someone who had been taken from him before she was born. But a family can preserve a person's influence. A child asks a question. A parent answers. A forgotten habit becomes meaningful. A handwritten message appears. And suddenly the person who has been absent for decades feels close again. That is why Catherine's reported decision to preserve the message carries so much weight. If she had simply released it, the words could have become another public artifact connected to Diana. Instead, keeping it private protected its personal meaning. The decision also avoided turning William's grief into public property. That matters because Diana's story has always existed under intense scrutiny. Her relationships, her marriage, her struggles, her work, and her death have been discussed repeatedly by people who never knew her personally. It only needs to mean something to the people receiving it. And that is where Charlotte's role becomes even more significant. She did not force William to revisit the past. She gave him a reason to see the past differently. Her presence represented the life Diana never got to witness. An 11-year-old girl, growing up inside a family Diana would have known intimately. A child developing her own sense of compassion. A young member of the family discovering that a famous grandmother was also simply a person. That may be the most powerful part of the entire story. William inherited memories. His children inherit stories. Charlotte is now beginning to turn those stories into choices. And that is a far more lasting form of remembrance than an anniversary headline. There was no need for a grand public spectacle. The meaningful moment happened through a child who wanted to understand where part of her family came from. That is why the story reaches beyond the royal family. Many families know what it means to preserve someone who has gone through stories, photographs, habits, recipes, letters, or objects left behind. The difference is that this family carries its memories under the constant gaze of the public. Yet beneath all of that remains something ordinary. A son misses his mother. A mother tries to help them connect. That is the human core. And it explains why the story should not be reduced to whether William cried. The more important question is what made him cry. According to the account, it was not simply sadness. He could see Diana's influence reaching his daughter without Diana being there to guide it herself. He could see a part of his mother's legacy continuing without anyone having to force it. And perhaps most painfully, he could imagine the relationship that should have existed between Diana and Charlotte. That is why the public reaction would be divided. Some viewers would see a moment and leave it there. Others would question reported details, wondering whether a palace exchange could be known with certainty alone. That skepticism is reasonable. Royal stories often grow through fragments, unnamed sources, interpretation, and fascination. But the emotional question survives the uncertainty. What happens when a child begins carrying a legacy that her father has spent his life trying to understand? And this is why this moment deserves attention rather than dismissal. If people only reward the loudest palace controversy, stories of family, grief, responsibility disappear. A like, a share, and a subscription seem small, but tell the platform that viewers want stories that look beyond headlines and ask what these moments mean for the people involved. The story therefore ends where it began, with a family standing beside the memory of a woman who never got to see this generation grow. Only now, the question is no longer whether Charlotte knew Diana. She never could. The question is whether Diana's values can still know Charlotte. If the answer is found in that letter, then the legacy has already moved beyond memory. And that may be the most powerful tribute Diana could have received on the birthday she never lived to see. If this story made you stop and think about what families owe the people they have lost, do not let it disappear beneath the next royal headline. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, like this video, and share it with someone who believes family memories should not be erased simply because powerful people would rather control the conversation. Your silence helps the noise win. Your support keeps these stories heard. And stay close, because the next story coming to this channel goes even deeper into the royal family, and what comes next is far more revealing than what happened here.